Welcome to the Global South Women's Forum on Sustainable Development 2021, hosted by International Women's Rights Action Watch, Asia Pacific. I'm Rachel Ong. I will be the technical host for this session. And before we start, we would like to share some virtual housekeeping announcements with you. This session provides interpretation in Spanish and Portuguese. Please go to interpretation to choose your language channel. Mute original audio to only hear the interpreter. Do note that captioning is available for this session. Please go to the three dots at the bottom of the screen that says more to access the captioning function. As participants, please turn off your videos and mute your microphones at all times unless the discussion is happening. If you are experiencing slow bandwidth, please close any unnecessary programs and/or applications on your device. Do use the public chat box to engage with each other throughout the session. This session is live streamed on ERA AP's Facebook page, and the recording will be available publicly afterwards. We are committed to making this space inclusive and safe, and will not tolerate harassment of any kind, including but not limited to deliberate intimidation or sustained disruption of discussions. Participants are obliged to be respectful and to avoid replicating societal prejudices and inequalities. Participants who engage in disruptive behavior may be removed without prior notice. And this will be all. Marissa, the floor is yours.
Hi, all. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, wherever you are. We're happy to have you here for a session, A Green Future for Us, youth activists in climate justice. Apologies. Okay, so firstly, we will start with brief bios of each panelist, each of our plenary speakers. So I'll start first with Dumiso from Success Capital, Botswana. And firstly, I should say it's going to be a bit of a conversation as we only have 1 hour. And activists will get to share their work as youth activists within the climate justice movement and any challenges or hopes for the future in this movement. So now I will go on to the bios. Apologies. So we'll start with Dumiso. Dumiso is from Success Capital in Botswana. Dumi, they, them, or their is proudly Pan-African and unequivocally non-binary queer feminist, working on eliminating the barriers between grassroots experiences and global policy making. Dumi is the founder of Success Capital, a beneficiary of the Climate Justice Resilience Fund, a queer youth feminist-led, managed, and serving grassroots organization, working on strengthening and safeguarding youth agency and autonomy in human rights and sustainable development, whilst challenging power, privilege, and patriarchy through intersectionality, underpinning participatory research, peer-to-peer knowledge, sharing, and advocacy. Dumi's consulting work includes serving as a facilitator of the Shift the Power UK Funders Collective and as a critical friend of Civicus's grassroots activist campaign for the 21st Century Citizen Action. Dumi is a standing international member representative of Amnesty International and the vice chair of Gender Dynamics, among other voluntary roles. Sorry, I just need to make this a little bigger. Okay. Belyndar Rikimani is a Solomon Islander who is a third-year law student at the University of the South Pacific. She's the vice president of the Pacific Islanders Students Fighting for Climate Justice and is currently the network engagement officer for the Pacific Islands Climate Action Network, which is co-leading a climate diplomacy project. She works with a lot of civil society organizations in the Pacific, engaging with young women and children in climate advocacy. She's who facilitated climate justice training for National Youth Council and Women Council in Vanuatu. She also works with communities and partners to engage in ocean health and sustainability projects like mangrove planting and waste management. And that is Belyndar from Pacific Islands Climate Action Network, also known as PICAN. Renata Koch Alvarenga, hope I said it correctly, is a leading voice in Brazil for gender and climate justice, having founded the global initiative EmpoderaClima to advocate for gender equality in climate policy with global self-youth. Renata is a master in public policy candidate at the Harvard Kennedy School, where she is a Belfer Young Leader Fellow. She's involved in several international spaces. She's a Girls 20 ambassador to Brazil, national gender youth activist of UN Women, Transform Education leader at the UN Girls Education Initiative, and the gender co-lead for youth at the UNFCCC. Before Harvard, she led the political work of the British government in Rio de Janeiro. Renata holds a bachelor's degree in international relations from Unicinos, having spent part of her graduate year at the Seton Hall School of Diplomacy. And finally, we have Ayesha Constable, who has paired her activism with her scholarship, having researched and published on the gender and climate change as part of her doctoral studies, which links her interest in agriculture and climate adaptation. She has researched extensively on youth and gender in climate change within the context of climate justice, contributing to global and regional policy and academic discourse on climate change. Her recent academic research has examined feminist activism with the application of an intersectional lens to examine the role of young women and girls in climate action in the Caribbean. She has served as a member of several regional and global youth networks, including the Caribbean Youth Environment Network, Commonwealth Youth Climate Network, is a former Caribbean coordinator for the Sustainable Development Solutions Youth Network, regional representative for Global Power Shift of 350.org, and is currently a global advisor to Frida, the Young Feminist Fund. She's the founder of the Young People for Action on Climate Change, Jamaica, also known as YPACC, an umbrella organization for youth-led climate groups, and of Girls Care, Girls for Climate Action for Resilience and Empowerment, which offers mentorship for girls in climate activism. She currently serves as the coordinator for the development of the National Adaptation Plan for Antigua and Barbuda. So there you have it. We have our 4 amazing panelists from countries all over the global south. And right now, I'll give them the opportunity to share a bit on what climate justice means to them as youth activists, their challenges that they've encountered as activists, some of their approaches to their advocacy, and most importantly, some of the successes and hope for their youth engagement within the climate justice movement. We can start with you, Dumiso, if that is okay.
Thank you so much, Marissa. Good morning, everyone. I think, climate justice for me means that one can rest without feeling like the world will end. It means that movements are resourced equitably in a reparative manner, redressing the harm done by colonialism, capitalism, and the subjugation of vulnerable groups. It means accountability for multinationals in all forms, not just curbing illicit financial flows, paying equitable tax and rehabilitating the environment for their operations, but also legacy beneficiation that exploited and extracted previous generations. It looks like peace processes in the Congo end in decades of conflict driven by capitalist governments and their benefactors, along with corruption. And it also looks like leaving the Okavango Delta in its beauty and declared heritage state. It looks like a reproductive justice in lieu of the militarist state, defunding arms for collective well-being whilst eliminating any possibilities of nuclear states in warfare or energy. It looks like a special rapporteur in climate and human rights to ensure accountability and progress tracking against the backdrop of the Sustainable Development Goals and leaving no one behind. It looks like BIPOC, queer, disabled, migrant, and indigenous folk respecting their ancestral land through practice and art without commodification, co-opting, or fear for looking or losing livelihood or the gains made in activism and exercising agency for social justice. And lastly, it looks like endowments for grassroots movements in lieu of corporate social responsibility, foundations that perform patchwork for tax breaks, self-preservation, and mental masturbation through the white gaze of saviorism for the problems that they have caused, especially when it represents elements that led to the discovery and enslavement of our people in our natural habitat.
Thank you, Dumiso. Belyndar, would you want to go next? Or also, Dumiso, if you want, you can continue to share on your specific advocacy practices when it comes to climate justice, and also any of your challenges in this area of work.
Sure thing. Sorry. So I think, in terms of advocacy work, the first thing that we've done is recognize the value system of knowledge production in how it forms the very basis of evidence-based decision making. And so it's decolonial feminist knowledge production that has been key for us through learning circles, podcast curation, intellectual leadership, and storytelling, recognizing of space isn't just enough, and that our experiences aren't just enough, and that there are value systems that aren't enough within neoliberal, liberal, and M&E indicator framing praxis. It's been very key for our shared peer-to-peer learning, different forms of exchange and collaboration to foster mutual accountability, solidarity, and intersectionality amongst those who are disenfranchised, excluded, with multiple identities and multiple struggles, because it is a common ground. And then lastly, it's allowed us to collaborate with others, other grassroots collective, nurturing feminist leadership and movement building at a grassroots level. There's only so much that can be done when there aren't enough resources, when socioeconomic rights are not justiciable, in our case in Botswana, and when the government does not create enough avenues for meaningful engagement within, for instance, our dualist system or narrow patriarchal consultative system across the Southern African region. I think, it's worth noting some of the challenges that we've met as early as 2014, including, queering climate justice when we're defined programmatically in advocacy and in public discourse by the HIV response or strategic litigation. Secondly, that there are inherent power dynamics where gatekeeping manifests at movement, advocacy, and resourcing levels. Thirdly, you might spark a fire, but you don't always get to enjoy the heat. And so that's a reality where the more radical and the more dynamic activists might not necessarily get invited to the table, despite initiating or sparking the conversations. I think it's important to mention burnout and fatigue, which are a norm with no social flaws or social protections, whilst navigating the triggers of trauma and intergenerational injustice as a queer migrant. And then fifth, the institutional racism that exists, misogyny, and the assumption that we do not have expertise. I don't think I have to explain further on that one. And then also just to mention the resourcing and policy engagements that are largely technical and scientific, masked under bilateral or multilateral frameworks, cooperation agreements, or infrastructural architecture that is often elitist and not enabling for young and diverse perspectives. And I think, in the words of Wangari Maathai, the generation that destroys the environment is not the generation that pays the price. And that is the biggest problem that we face. Thank you, Marissa.
Thank you so much, Dumi, and so much you've shared that we can think about, especially coming from young activists. I think, that we young persons carry the knowledge or yesterday we had a conversation about how we structure our advocacy, and a lot of times advocacy being against issues. But now I think that we're talking in terms of you, or from what you've said, in terms of advocacy towards, and I'm very happy to hear your comments on that. I'd like to ask Belyndar, are you okay to speak? You're muted, and please remember everyone to speak slowly for the translators. You're muted, Belyndar. Renata, do you want to go until we can figure out what's going on with Belyndar? Sure, go ahead.
Yes, can I go? Okay, amazing. First of all, hello everyone. Good morning, afternoon, or evening. I'm calling from the US. I'm from Brazil, but it's evening over here. First of all, let me just say it's such a pleasure to be here. It's such a powerful conference overall that's happening in the next few days. And this session specifically, right, talking about the youth power and youth activism and youth leadership. So I'm just really, really honored. Thank you so much for having me. In terms of what climate justice means to me, I mean, I echo the words just said, and what has been, what is the focus of this event, which is leaving no one behind, right? So I think the idea of climate justice is making sure that we're tackling the climate crisis, which I'm sure everyone can agree is our biggest challenge nowadays, but making sure we're tackling it not from just a scientific or political perspective, but really from a people-centered perspective, right? So we need to include the people who are most affected every single day by climate. And I mean, I think there's no better days for us to be thinking about this. Actually, just yesterday was the March of Indigenous Peoples in Brazil, and with EmpoderaClima, which is the organization that I'm representing, we had the honor of organizing an event about Indigenous and feminist leadership in the Amazon region, so all over Latin America. And that was just yesterday. And we had a lot of powerful discussions about why it's so important that we have feminist leadership and feminist solutions, especially from Indigenous leaders, from young women and girls, people with disabilities, Black women, those people who are not just victims, not just marginalized, but on the leadership at the local context, right? So I think climate justice is about bringing those people who already have so much power, so much knowledge, so much richness in what they do, and bringing them to where we need them to be, right? In terms of the political world, which we know is still very male dominated and dominated by, you know, not a lot of young people, just older men. And we see the consequences of that, right? In the negotiations, in the policy decisions. So climate justice to me is really ensuring that we're including the people who are most affected and who should be able to share their lived experiences in those environments as much as we can. I think I'll leave the challenges for later and allow Belyndar to speak, but yeah, really happy and honored to be here.
Thank you so much, Renata. Belyndar. Okay, great. I see you're unmuted. Would you like to go now? Sure.
Thank you, Marisha. I am so sorry earlier. The internet here in the Pacific is not always good. So
that's okay.
Having that, but thank you very much. I'm very honored to be talking aside very powerful panelists that have shared very great experience of the work that they're doing in their respective countries, and I am very amazed to hear what Dumiso has shared about the work in Alvarenga. That is so good, and it's so inspiring to hear what you guys are doing on the other end. So thank you very much for sharing your experience. To me, when I think about climate justice, my mind goes really wild. It covers a lot of things. When I think about climate justice, I think about what's really happening back home, what's happening to my aunties, my uncle, my nieces, my nephew in my home country that are facing the severe impacts of climate change every day. And having the fact that they haven't contributed too much to the carbon emissions and the disasters that we're facing, yet they are the ones that are really facing the very bad effects of climate crisis. And when I think about climate justice, I see that as it is a point where we could, have a greater recognition on the rights of the vulnerable people that, especially from the global south, that are very affected by sea level rise, by the changing weather patterns, by coral bleaching, and by all that. I see firsthand impacts of it in my country, in my island every day. And when I think about climate justice, I think about addressing those things, you know, stepping up and actually be vocal for the issues that a lot of my people haven't had the space and haven't had the opportunity to actually voice out their concerns. And like in my it's very high in my country when we talk about climate justice, because people often see it as very complex and it's very hard to understand without knowing that it's what we have been facing every day of our lives. So when I think about climate justice, I think about getting a legal redress to address the damages that my people have suffered due to the impacts of climate change, and to take it to a more concerted and ambitious action to ensure that the rights of our people, my people, are restored and are safeguarded. And that includes, of course, the marginalized people, as Renata have also mentioned, and Dumi has also mentioned, that, you know, that are suffering worldwide from poverty, hunger, ill health, and injustices. And that's how I see the importance of having climate justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Belyndar. I really appreciate that. And then Ayesha, are you happy to share?
Yes, can you confirm that you're hearing me? Yes, okay. Yeah, thank you all so much. I'm very, very happy to be here. I think this is, for me, this is the answer to maybe the last question that you asked in that list of questions. Is one of the moments of hope. I think for me, this panel, this conversation tonight is my response to that question because for us to be able to connect and have this conversation with the work that we're all doing respectively in our own little corners, to put it together here, you know, and to really see the wider impact of it and how we can build on the work that we're all doing is a huge win. The question of climate justice, as we're now discussing, I don't think there's a lot more that needs to be said after what Dumi said. Dumi, that was heartfelt, as was what you said, Belyndar, really connecting it to home and the people of it. The point that Renata made about making it people-centered. Dumi, I think you did an excellent job of, you know, kind of giving us that big picture framing, contextualizing this conversation, and all the more technical, legislative, and academic bits of information that we really need to piece together to answer this question and to solve this puzzle that is the climate crisis. And Renata, I think, you know, speaking to the indigenous people of Brazil, which is such a very topical, unfortunately, issue at the moment, you know, so real, so pointed, brings home the matter in all its forms, is really where it's at. I think, again, the little bit that I would add to that of what climate justice is that in our own context in the Caribbean, it is very similar to what the rest of the global South says climate justice is. It's looking at the ravages and the sustained impacts of colonialism and how that has undermined the capacity of global South countries to respond to climate impact and enhance their vulnerability to the climate crisis. It's looking at the within the different countries, who are the most vulnerable, what are the perceived notions of vulnerability and the communities that are perceived as most vulnerable, whether, you know, true or realized, and addressing those, redressing that where we need to, bringing those communities into the fold and making this conversation not about a tokenistic approach to bring them to the table, but recognizing that solutions lie in some of these communities and people who have long been fighting this issue. You know, indigenous communities, for instance, they have long been adapting to climate change. I've heard, you know, other speakers in other spaces talk about how, you know, we talk about water harvesting now in all the national adaptation plans across the world, as though it's this new idea that, you know, Europeans came up with. This is something the Caribbean that communities and our grandmothers and grandparents have long been doing, you know, setting up these little systems. So, you know, it's about looking at that, looking at the agency, the power of these people and these institutions. And I think overall, just addressing the fact that the playing field has historically been tilted in the favor of those up north, for what it's worth, and addressing and reshifting or rebalancing that playing field, so that those persons who are at the lower end of the spectrum, and Belyndar, you spoke to that, the persons who are worst impacted by this crisis now, who have historically contributed the least to this problem, are not treated as, you know, what lefts, as we would say in Jamaican parlance, are not treated as though you're doing them a favor, because you're really not doing them a favor. We're owed this, right? And so climate justice as well is reparative justice. And I think I'll end by saying climate justice at this point is giving to SIDS and giving to vulnerable countries what we are due and owed in terms of climate finance.
Wow, I don't know what to say or what else to say after that very powerful closing of that. And we still have 30 minutes more. Thank you so much for that also, Ayesha. But I'm also happy that we can all build on, or that you can all build on what was said from each other. And it really shows too that this isn't just an issue that's in the Pacific, it's not an issue just specifically to Africa, the Caribbean, Latin America, but it's very broadly applicable to the global South. But what I do want to ask, and it wasn't something that, you know, I thought of until hearing you say it, but seeing how interconnected all of these issues are, what I do want to ask, and even if you take time to answer it, is what do you see? And I haven't touched on the challenges yet. However, I want you to think about, for the closing then, what do you see us doing as we represent different global South regions, but all facing the same issues? What do you see as, you know, possible changes that we can make, possible ways in which we can work together as global South activists, especially you, strong youth activists within the movement? What do you see as steps that can be taken to help in taking on this climate justice fight in the future? But what I would ask about now more specifically is your challenges, because you shared a lot in terms of what you see are the issues, or more so what are some of the things that we constantly see that is the problem when it comes to climate justice, who aren't listening, who aren't in the room, etc. With a lot of times youth being marginalized and other communities, indigenous women, etc. So what are some of the challenges you more specifically have experienced, whether it's trying to bring these conversations to certain spaces within country or globally? What are some of those challenges that you have faced in your work and continue to face? Dumi, would you like to start us off?
Thanks, Marissa. I think I gave quite a list, and maybe the only more notable one is how we've often been left to either defend our existence or even try and validate why we're there. And this often leads to imposter syndrome, such that when you occupy the space, you're not then able to meaningfully participate, because there's always another issue in terms of eligibility, logistics, and the reality that I have to go back home and pay my bills and black tax. And so there's so many other dynamics that I think are at play that we don't recognize within the context of activism, particularly around care work at individual, household, and collective levels. And that there is an element of healing that is often left behind, and that this doesn't always manifest in the context of solidarity, in the context of philanthropy, because it's not recognized. We don't recognize intergenerational trauma and harm over and above the traumas that I have, the triggers that I have to sort of live through and navigate within the context of systemic discrimination, within the context of institutional racism, where, for instance, one gets a job rescinded, or, having to go through multiple hoops just to access a specific space. Why should a young activist take 7 years to access a UN space? It's not okay in the context of, the decade of action. It's not okay in the the context of globalization and digitalization. And so I think the reality is that, we are often either distracted, if not made to jump extra hoops, because there's an expectation that our resilience means we have to be extra excellent. And the reality is that it should just be okay and normal for me to be able to access a space without having to be of excellence, without having to, perform my struggles. And the reality is that this capitalist framing of development, capitalist framing of what's valuable and what's successful in the context of advocacy is largely driving a lot of young people into burnout, into fatigue. And I must say, it's exhausting, just having to navigate all these different challenges and then still understand how your body is politicized, sexualized, and erased by the same individuals that you have to turn to ensure that you're included in the context of policy making. So I think it's really, it's exhausting, to be quite honest. And I think that's maybe the underlying challenge that I can speak to.
Thank you so much for that, Dumi. Like, I definitely share those sentiments. I'm sure a lot of us here as activists do also. I don't know if there's anything else that the others want to add. Belyndar, Ayesha, Renata, is there anything you think you need to add to what Dumi has said?
To be honest, I echo what Dumi said. He actually said what's in my heart, and I'm very happy that he actually stressed out all the underlying challenges that not just, I thought that we are the ones who are actually facing the same issue, but it's just eye-opening for me to see the fact that they, like, on the other side of the world, they're actually facing the same struggles that we're facing. And I'm very humbled to hear what Dumi has shared. And like for us in the Pacific, the challenges that we face is we need support, but we don't have it. We have the messaging, but we don't have the support. It's just the lack of capacity that we have in the moment. And often we're faced with the fact that, we are not good enough for the work that we do. And we're faced with the stigma that, you're just wasting your time on something that is gonna happen, and we'll all get there at one point. And it's something that we are faced with every day with the work that we do. But I'm very happy to hear what Dumi has said, and thank you very much for actually saying that that covers all of our experience in what you've said to me. So thank you. That's all from me, Marisha.
Renata, Ayesha, anything? Sure.
Yeah, I mean, perfectly said, Dumi and Belyndar. I think the what I could just compliment, it's not even add to these powerful statements, is I think a lot about the access to policy, right? I mentioned in my opening statement, just because it's what I study, I think we can make change with policy. But when you think about the climate negotiations, they're always really far from where we are, right? So even if we're just talking about geography, it's hard to access it on the ground. So even thinking, from a Latin American perspective, we had COP25 presided by Chile, and then it ended up being in Spain. So a lot of my climate activist friends from Latin America were simply not able to go, right? And it may seem like it's just, I'm not able to go to a conference, but these are powerful spaces, right? Where the decisions are taking place. And we can think about COP in Fiji as well, and happening in Bonn, and all of the implications of that. And I think it's the 13th already for many of you. For me, it's still September 12th. September 12th is the International Day of South-South Cooperation. So I was thinking a lot about this today, and thinking about how we, as the Global South youth and Global South countries, we can't be anymore in this position where the Global North is, just helping us with funding or having this like patriarchal role, but instead we should be leading the change, right? We should be the ones leading that cooperation. So I think it's super powerful that we're having these discussions about Global South youth, Global South gender and climate justice in such an important day, in the South-South Cooperation Day, because I really feel like it's, due time that we change the narrative, that we move beyond these structures, as Dumi was saying about colonialism and post-colonialism, and how do we move that to make sure that we are in the leadership and not just as what we call like a token, right? A little decorative piece in these high-level conferences, one of us there. representing our population, because I know that I'm not a representative of Brazil. Brazil is huge. There's so many amazing, powerful people of all different races and backgrounds, and we need everyone to be represented if we want to have equality, not just one of us who has the privilege of speaking English, who has the privilege of being able to get a visa and to travel to those spaces. So I've been reflecting a lot on that and those power balances that are related to patriarchy and colonialism, and how we can break those barriers in the future.
Ayesha?
Yeah, again, Dumi, they just keep coming with all the bills and receipts and articulating it in such powerful words. I again, adding to it in based on my own work and context, I would say that the greatest challenge for us, and I think it ties back to what Dumi would have said, is in the global South, being able to advocate or be an activist is considered a luxury, right? And so even with the work that we're doing, a lot of the young people who we think we're speaking on behalf of, they're like, how you have time, how you have the liberty of finding time to sit down and do this free work. Me hungry. I need to find food, so people are concerned with their basic bread and butter issues while the rest of us are traveling to COP, or sitting down on our computers having this face-to-face conversation. So, there is that need to deal with the bread and butter belly issues that a lot of young people have to contend with. So, and so I try to say sometimes in their defense that it's not that they don't care. It's not that they do not live every day with the ravages of climate change. That is in their own right, in their own defense, that is their form of activism, surviving, because they face the brunt of the impacts of climate change on a day-to-day basis, but they get up every day and they face and they have to survive, right? And so that is what we have to contend with. And so there is, I don't consider us, because I know I speak on behalf of a few colleagues of mine when I say, we're not elites, but we have a little bit more than the other young people that we're speaking for, trying to represent at this level, because we can take the time to do this work, and they honestly cannot, because they just have to deal with the survive, right? And so the critical mass that we would like to say that we have to really amplify the voice of young people in the Caribbean and young women in the Caribbean as activists, we do not necessarily have, because the bulk of that population is busy trying to survive. And the rest of us who are doing this work, I translate to Jamaican when I say we're tired, right? So there is so much and no more we can do, because we feel like we're carrying our half of the sky plus the next half and trying to balance, and it's hard, right? Or the other challenge that we face is the Eurocentric ideals around this work, which continue to push out and block out our face and our voice. The issue of Vanessa Nakati, and I recount this every chance I get, where she was erased from that magazine, standing next to her Caucasian colleagues or fairer skinned colleagues, I think was the classic manifestation of what we face daily when we're silenced and erased from those spaces. So even when you get to the room where the picture is being taken, they will take your picture and then crop you out. And that's a real challenge in this space. The other challenge, and I suppose maybe it's a little bit more localized, ageism is a huge reality that young women contend with in this work. There are older women who are very much intent on keeping this space exclusive, and there are traditional ideas about young people being seen and not heard, speak when you're spoken to. I remember a colleague and I being at a COP in a room for women. I think it was the gender constituency room, and there was an old African woman in the space. And she outrightly told us to get out because we're young. And I remember my colleague from Kenya saying, I will not respond to you because you're older than me. And honestly, I come from the Caribbean where we respond respectfully to those utterances, and I responded respectfully. And my point then was that you cannot be standing in defense of equity and justice and at the same time be pulling us down. It no work that way, right? You're either for justice or against it, pick your side. So, you know, those I think are three of the key challenges that we face daily, and we wake up every day and determine that despite those odds, we're going to show up and show up fully.
Very, very well said from all of you. And I really do see and understand these challenges of being a young activist or a youth activist. I am not possibly as young as I used to be, but I do very much also understand in terms of age, when you look at intergenerational activism, feminism, etc., whatever it is, there is definitely that divide. There's also persons pushing us from spaces or thinking that we don't belong, which is often hard, but we push through. But I also do agree with Dumi, like all of your sentiments in terms of burnout and, you know, like doing the work, but also feeling like there's also no space for us. And I really can't add anything else. I think everyone just put it so perfectly. And I hope that persons can hear this from you and, you know, be motivated to make spaces not just inclusive as we always ask for. We ask for spaces inclusive of those marginalized, but youth voices are important in this movement, and all of our advocacy is very important. So there must be space given to us, even in terms of what Ayesha said, and, you know, some of us being able to travel to certain meetings, etc. That is true. Like, where are our voices when it's necessary within these spaces, especially for negotiations, etc. Our presence isn't there, and there's a need for that. And we need to also, again, find ways in which we can get persons to commit to such. So with that said, all of your thoughts and experiences, etc. shared, my final question to you is, can you describe or share any moments of success and hope regarding youth engagement in the future? I know you would have touched briefly on it, but any specific moments as it relates to your context, all being youth, the specific communities you work with. So I heard Renata made mention to Indigenous women and girls. Ayesha made mention to young girls specifically. I know Dumi works a lot in terms of like LGBTI community, etc. Are there any glimpses of success or hope in the future that you look forward to, that you think in some way that youth engagement is very key to? I know that we have COP26 on the horizon, but I'm not sure what engagement will look like. And that's the same for everyone. Who can afford to go to COP? With COVID also around, you know, there are different things, whether it's quarantine, whether it's simply airfare, vaccine inequity is an issue. So what are your hopes, especially with COVID now, this pandemic that we're living through? Like, what does the future of climate justice as youth activists look like for you? I'm not sure who's excited to start, but do go freely.
I will start. I believe that in addition to the work that has been going on, we need to build or enhance the connections between these different groups across the world. So we have all this amazing work happening at all these levels in all these corners of the world in the global south, but it's happening in these little pockets. And so again, the benefit of the numbers, the benefit of the amplification of voices will come when we work together more intentionally, right? So I think especially coming out of this conversation, I would love to see how we can use this as a launching pad for something else that is more sustainable, something that has a bigger reach than the work that we're all doing individually, and something that we can decisively say was an output, you know, the legacy of this here conversation. I believe we need to continue, but more, again, deliberately tell our stories in our own voices. Again, challenging the Eurocentric ideals and the Eurocentric narrative about climate change. This framing of people from the global south as victims of climate change, it has begun to change, but there is literature still that puts us as victims, whereas people in the global north are, you know, the ones who are the saviors. I'm tired of it. And I'm sorry to the translators. I keep slipping into dialect. I know I'm probably giving you a tough time, but it's where I feel happiest. That's where I feel most authentic, I should say. That is something that we need to challenge, you know. So writing our own stories, telling our own stories in our own voices, representing the faces and the voices of those persons who we say that we're here for and speaking to. That I want to see more efficiently and actively done across the global south. And I believe as well that challenging the decision makers in our spaces is something that we also need to be a little bit more fierce about. And I know the challenges, it's one of the things I would have pointed out as a challenge in the global south, because our communities, our islands are so small and insular. You run the risk of being kicked out of school, losing a job opportunity, you know, family being victimized if you speak too loudly or too boldly. But I think there is need for that, because I know in the Caribbean, for instance, or politicians or decision makers continue to pander a lot to the north. They'll check a box here, they'll develop a strategy there, but it is not, they're not setting ambitious targets, and they're not making decisions that are in the best interest of the people who are most vulnerable to the worst impacts of the climate crisis. And so there's a place for us to be very loud and very disruptive about the need for that level of leadership.
I'll just add a little bit on what Ayesha has said. I am so happy that I had this space to have this conversation with you all, and like inside of me, I'm like beaming with so much happiness just to hear what you have said and the empowered encouragement that comes from you all. And for me, I think moving forward is like I wanted to have a collaborative voice, both the regional voice and the world voice. You know, we need to have the same messaging together that stands out from the other end to the other end. And that's what we are working on at the moment. For all of us here in the Pacific, we are trying to breach that connection with activists, not just from the Pacific itself, but also out in the global north. And it has been working really well for us, and we've seen the impact that we've done. Like our stories doesn't just stays with us, but it goes out to others, and it actually empowers them to kind of what we have. And it has been something that we have been working on towards COP26. You know, we say that even though we don't have, and that our asks, our stories will never not be empty here in the Pacific. It has to reach the highest level of decision that we want to see changes. And one is each of us, you have the power to make a difference wherever you are. You know, it doesn't matter how small or how big you are, the knowledge or what you have, whether you have it, you have that power inside of you to make a difference in your community, in your work, in your school. You know, that doesn't hold you back from saying what's in your heart. And that's one of the things that really inspires me to be in this space for as long as I can be, and actually just kind of share what I want to share with others, and actually see them grow much more better than the level that I am today. And one thing that I also want to put across is that, you know, each of us, we have that spirit of activism inside. The generation that we are now, we are a generation of peacemakers, of climate activists, of powerful leaders, you know, and that's the change we want to see, because we already have it inside of ourselves. If our leaders don't give us the platform, we make the platform, we provide the space that we could share our voice. And that's what I shared solidarity with all the amazing speakers that are here today. You know, we have each other. We are not in this alone. We are in this together, and together we can make a change. So thank you.
I love that. I guess I can continue on the path, but I mean, such powerful statements. And I mean, as you said, Belyndar, I think this is one of the most important things for us to keep going, right? Because there is eco-anxiety. It's so hard to work with climate change every single day and see everything that's happening. But I think these spaces, even though it's through a screen at the moment and we can't dance together and hug each other and feel the energy, I feel the energy from here. So thank you all for that. And just to add in terms of hope and successes, one thing that I'd say that I'm seeing a little bit of the shift is in terms of translating policy into action, right? So, I mean, as I said, I've been following a little bit of the gender work internationally, and sometimes it's hard to grasp that because we have this great document, which is the Gender Action Plan of the UN climate change. But what does that mean, right? And if I tell anyone that I know at any level in Brazil, most of them won't know what the Gender Action Plan is, right? And that's concerning not on the fact that they don't know, the fact that this is not in the media, that our policymakers are not talking about it. And we've been at EmpoderaClima and with other local NGOs in Brazil, we've been talking a lot about tropicalizing the Gender Action Plan. And how can we not only translate it, because, for example, it's not translated into Portuguese, which is one start, right? It's the language barrier is there. 95% of Brazilians don't speak English. How can you expect indigenous Brazilian women to act on the Gender Action Plan and make use of the resources that are there? So that's one thing, but not just translating in terms of language, but translating in terms of wording, because it's so complicated, it's so difficult to access these documents. So, when I go to these conferences and we talk about the NDCs and the 1.5 degree target and the Paris Agreement, how do we bring that back, right? So this is one of the things I've been seeing a lot of youth activists try to do. And I think sometimes because we're surrounded by so many amazing people in this fight, it's hard sometimes, for me at least, to remember, there's still such a long way to go. And I'll give you just one quick example. I went to COP25, I had the privilege to go, and I was sitting down writing my notes between meetings, and I have a sticker on my computer that says in Portuguese, "Smash the patriarchy, save the planet." And one diplomat from a Latin American country sat down next to me, he saw the sticker and he said, "Oh, you're one of those activists just trying to dismantle the system. What does that even mean?" He basically tried to diminish my power of being there as a young activist because I had stickers on my laptop, because it was saying "smash the patriarchy." And to remind you, this was a diplomat with a key power and key decision-making space in those negotiations. So it's just to remind us that we still have so much to do, and we're still so far from achieving gender equality. But one great way to start is by having you all, those powerful people, leading the change in their countries, in their communities, at those spaces, because we and you and everyone else who is not even able to be here represent that fight much more than just a diplomat who's there and doesn't understand why this issue is so important at the core, which is justice, right? It's the people. So we always go back to that. So just wanted, I know it's not such a positive note, but to remind us that we have a lot of work to do, but you're so powerful and so knowledgeable. And if you can get to those spaces with so many others in your community, I think we really can make positive change and fight the climate crisis with justice and equity.
Thank you so much, Belyndar, Ayesha, and Renata. And I think you've said quite a lot. And I mean, it's been an amazing discussion. And if you may allow me, Marissa, a little bit to just take it a little bit backwards a bit. I think, palatability, professionalism, meritocracy, and the demarcation of borders, along with programming, particularly around linguistic, francophone, lusophone, and anglophone sort of programming, are synonyms of institutional racism and subjugation of our existence. These are forms of control. We must be, consumed only to perform poverty and struggle or to gatekeep information and access. And these are tools that are used by those in power, those who dictate, what goes on the agenda. And essentially, that's how we're then controlled in terms of how we can then present the issues that affect us the most, because we must prioritize and we must sort of make sure that we're able to incrementally, whether you're talking about it in the context of strategic litigation or in advocacy. I think also, we operate, as competition as opposed to collaboration or collectivism. And it's really an oxymoron because so many, funding solicitation applications request, for solidarity or for movement building. But yet we say others are either invalidated, their values or their concerns or their struggles aren't, if not credible enough, they aren't weighted enough to meet the metrics of resourcing. And I think when I was in a donor-only space, as we were trying to imagine and create a different world in terms of partnerships, I was quite surprised when someone spoke about all these different protest movements, from Nigeria to the US to Latin America. And they spoke about how it is difficult to then identify a leader or to then sort of partner with an institution. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, but why must we sort of still conform to individualism? You're talking about a protest movement. Why must we find leaders and idolize individuals within the context of celebrity activism? And so I think, this is a praxis that we need to sort of change. One other thing that I think is obviously quite, different is recognizing risk as a metric. I think, we need to devalue success as it's known, particularly within a capitalist framing. And I think, we need to understand what securing rest is. I cannot imagine that our ancestors dreamt of continuously working or a dream job, or they felt like they could, opt out of social justice work. And so I think, for me, it's a form of healing and being able to rest. And that's a metric on its own. There's such a widespread urgency in the crisis, whether social media, convening spaces, and even climate philanthropy. And that is great. And I think it's a moment to galvanize that with feminist leadership and solidarity, especially with perpetual variant forms of violence that many in the global south are still subject to. Misuya Yamadal said, we must remember that one of the most insidious ways of keeping women and minorities powerless is to let them only talk about harmless and inconsequential subjects. We can speak about the UN Youth Action Summit and other global movements, but that's already out there. And I think we need elements to celebrate, and that's what's missing. This is because there's such a concerted effort around disinformation, corporate lobbying, gender ideologies, and racism. And I think, the fact that these can be brought up in public, discourse and that we can have this conversation really allows for unlearning and relearning and better ways of organizing. And I think that's in itself a success. It's a reflection of growing and healthy movements. I think, the focus really should be in the process of transformation as opposed to, end products or end picture. I think we've learned from injustices historically that, violence and subjugation or oppression of different groups is perpetual. We can speak about the suffrage movement, but then we still see the elimination of voting rights acts that's happening in more democracy or democratized nations. And so this is important for us to always be conscious of. And lastly, understanding that organizing is messy and that it's, we're still in the mud of this, and that it moves away from the assumption that perpetual growth and productivity cannot be matched or cannot be countered by kindness, particularly with the grief and the loss of this pandemic. And I think it's important for us to center those who are impacted, particularly in narratives and I guess in affording space. One might say, we're failing forward as muddy and as messy as we are, but, just our existence and resistance is still a hallmark and something worth celebrating. The reframing of climate towards human rights discourse is really powerful. And I think this has allowed for cross-pollination and intersectional leadership. You no longer think of Greenpeace or GIZ, but now you can even think of, the Amnesty and the UAF. Even better, it's you no longer think about the think tank. that that dictates the discourse, but you think about Vanessa Nakate. So I think it's amazing that we're engaged in this work. And I will just close with the words of Angela Davis, speaking about how environmental justice is ground zero for all kinds of injustices. And if we don't manage to save the planet, then it makes very little sense to be involved in other struggles that we face. And as soon as we purge the world of racism, there's still no planet left, to appreciate in a non-racist world. Or we finally manage to deal with misogyny, and then the climate change is so bad that there is no future that would be free, feminist, and enabling of everyone to thrive. Thank you.
On that note, I want to thank all of you for being here. I think all of you said amazing things in terms of the hopes and successes for this movement, especially with youth voices present. But Dumi, I completely appreciate your closing of it in terms of you wrapped up everything we said. Well, everything Ayesha, Belyndar, and Renata said definitely very powerfully, and we really appreciate this. I hope that this space has also created whether it's a connection between you four or just in general to see that they are climate activists, youth activists, especially out there doing this work, who are actually passionate about this work, who regardless of region, context, communities in which you serve, you work with, or that you are a part of, that this work is being done, even though it seems like it's just in a vacuum, that in some ways connections are important, building allyship across regions. The global south, especially now with the COVID pandemic, are quite vital to this work. And I hope that it also inspires you to go further, keep on pushing on. We know that burnout is a thing. We know that we are definitely all burnt out, but I hope that this is also a glimpse of hope for all of you. And that I want to say that we at URL really appreciate your voices here this morning. We appreciate all that you've shared your knowledge. And I hope that this knowledge, these experiences can inspire someone else. Thank you so much.